This book is not about becoming more motivated, more inspired, or more emotionally driven. It is about removing the invisible mechanisms that make you inconsistent, even when you know exactly what to do. By the time you finish this book, discipline will no longer feel like something you try to summon. It will feel like something that operates automatically, even on days when motivation is completely absent. You will learn why motivation fails, why willpower collapses, and why most self-discipline systems break at the exact moment they are supposed to work. More importantly, you will learn what actually sustains action when desire is gone, emotion is heavy, and the old identity is fighting to stay in control. This is not a collection of habits or productivity tricks. It is a structural model that rewires how action, identity, and consistency interact. As you move through this book, your understanding of discipline will shift. What once felt like a personal flaw will reveal itself as a predictable system error. You will learn how identity produces behavior, how resistance is generated, how actions become evidence, and how discipline becomes inevitable when the system is aligned. The goal is not to push harder, but to remove negotiation entirely. This book is designed to be listened to slowly or in parts. Each chapter builds on the previous one, but each also stands on its own as a mechanism you can return to when resistance appears. If you are listening in sessions, mark the chapter you are on before stopping, not because you will forget the information, but because you will want to return to specific moments when execution becomes difficult. This book is not meant to be consumed once and remembered. It is meant to be used. If you apply what you are about to hear, discipline will stop feeling fragile. Action will stop depending on mood. Consistency will stop requiring effort. The person who finishes this book will not be more motivated. They will be structurally different. And that difference will change how you act for the rest of your life. Chapter 1. Motivation is a lie. Motivation is one of the most misunderstood forces in human behavior. It feels powerful, urgent, and decisive, which is precisely why people mistake it for a foundation. But motivation is not a cause, it is a symptom. It is an emotional surge that appears when novelty, hope, and imagination briefly align. It creates the sensation of forward movement before reality has asked for payment. Most people begin every meaningful change under the influence of motivation. There is clarity, energy, and a sense of inevitability. Action feels light. Effort feels justified. The mind quietly concludes that this time will be different. But what is actually happening is not discipline and not commitment. It is chemical permission. Dopamine is released because the future looks better than the present, and no real cost has yet been incurred. Motivation always fades for the same reason. The moment action begins to demand consistency rather than excitement, the nervous system detects threat. Not a threat to survival, but a threat to identity stability. Boredom, discomfort, uncertainty, and delayed reward are interpreted as signals that something is wrong. At that point, the emotional fuel that once felt endless collapses. This is not a personal failure. It is a predictable biological response. The critical mistake is assuming that motivation is supposed to last. It is not. Motivation is designed to initiate movement, not sustain it. It gets you started, not finished. Expecting motivation to carry you through friction is like expecting adrenaline to power a long-distance journey. It was never built for that role. When someone relies on motivation, they unknowingly form an internal contract. The contract says that action will continue as long as it feels emotionally supportive. As long as there is excitement, clarity, or pleasure, the behavior remains acceptable. The moment action becomes heavy, slow, or unrewarding, the contract is broken. Behavior stops, and the mind searches for a justification that sounds reasonable. Loss of momentum, lack of motivation, poor timing. These are not causes. They are explanations created after the fact. This reveals a deeper truth. Motivation-based discipline is not discipline at all. It is emotional obedience. Action becomes conditional on feeling a certain way. And because emotional states are unstable, the behavior built on them is unstable as well. The individual does not fail because of laziness or lack of information. They fail because the system they are using cannot survive emotional fluctuation. Emotion is reactive. It responds to sleep, stress, novelty, social feedback, and countless variables outside conscious control. Identity, on the other hand, is structural. It determines what feels negotiable and what does not. When identity is aligned with an action, the action occurs even in the absence of desire. When identity is not aligned, no amount of motivation can sustain consistency. This is why discipline collapses at the same point every time, not at the beginning, but after the initial emotional high fades, not when progress is visible, but when progress becomes subtle, not when action feels rewarding, but when it feels repetitive. That moment is not a test of motivation. It is a test of identity. The belief that motivation must be present in order to act creates a dangerous dependency. It trains the mind to wait for permission before moving. Over time, this erodes self-trust. Each abandoned attempt becomes evidence that consistency is impossible. The automatic reinforcement mechanism quietly records these failures as proof of who you are, not disciplined, not consistent, not reliable. This evidence compounds, and the identity becomes heavier and harder to escape. The truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. Discipline does not come from feeling ready. It comes from acting without negotiation. It comes from separating decision from emotion. The moment you require a certain internal state in order to act, you surrender control to volatility. Motivation is not the enemy, but it is not the solution. It is a spark, not a structure. It is useful at the beginning and irrelevant afterward. The sooner this is understood, the sooner discipline can be rebuilt on something that does not disappear when conditions change. What actually determines whether you continue or quit has nothing to do with motivation at all. It has to do with the exact point where you always break, the moment resistance appears and the hidden pattern behind every abandonment. That pattern is not random, and in the next chapter it will be exposed. The next chapter will map that exact breaking point and explain why you always stop when you do. Chapter 2. Why you always quit at the same point. People believe quitting is impulsive. They think they stop because something unexpected happened, because life got busy, because motivation disappeared, or because circumstances changed. This belief protects the ego, but it hides the truth. Quitting is not spontaneous, it is structured. It happens at a precise and predictable point every time. If you look closely at your past attempts to change, a pattern emerges. Not in the details of the goal, but in the internal experience surrounding abandonment. The projects may differ, the habits may change, but the moment you disengage feels familiar. The same emotional texture appears, the same heaviness, the same quiet justification, the same internal dialogue that makes stopping feel reasonable rather than catastrophic. This is not coincidence, it is conditioning. Every attempt to change moves through the same invisible sequence. At first, action feels expansive. There is novelty and hope. Then resistance appears, not as a dramatic obstacle, but as a subtle shift in state. The task feels heavier, the reward feels distant. The excitement fades. This is the exact moment where most people believe something has gone wrong. In reality, this is the first moment where something real begins. That moment is where identity is challenged. Consistency threatens the existing self-concept. It introduces a version of you that behaves differently, expects more, and tolerates discomfort longer. The nervous system interprets this shift as instability. And instability, even when it leads to growth, is registered as danger. The body does not ask whether the change is good for you. It asks whether the change is familiar. When unfamiliar behavior persists beyond the initial emotional high, the system activates resistance. This resistance does not arrive as a clear command to stop. It arrives as doubt, fatigue, distraction, emotional flatness, or sudden interest in alternatives. It feels personal, but it is mechanical. It is the old identity attempting to restore equilibrium. This is why you quit at the same point every time, not because you lack discipline, but because the internal cost crosses a threshold you have never trained yourself to pass. That threshold is not physical, it is emotional. It is the moment when action stops feeling aligned with who you believe you are. At that point, the mind begins to negotiate. It reframes quitting as intelligence rather than avoidance. It tells you that rest is strategic, that timing is off, that conditions will be better later. These explanations feel rational because they are emotionally soothing. They reduce internal friction. And because the brain is designed to minimize discomfort, it accepts them without interrogation. Each time this happens, the outcome is the same. Action stops, relief appears, and a subtle but critical reinforcement takes place. The system learns that discomfort leads to withdrawal, and withdrawal leads to emotional safety. This lesson is recorded. The next time you attempt change, resistance appears sooner and with more authority. This is the self-interference loop. Attempted change creates discomfort. Discomfort activates emotional resistance. Resistance leads to avoidance. Avoidance restores the old identity. The loop closes, and the belief that consistency is impossible becomes stronger. What makes this loop so powerful is that it operates below conscious intention. You may want the outcome deeply. You may understand the benefits intellectually. None of that matters if the internal threshold remains unchanged. Desire does not override identity. Awareness alone does not dissolve resistance. Until you can recognize resistance not as a signal to stop, but as evidence that you are approaching the exact boundary of your current identity, discipline will always fail at the same place. You will continue to interpret the moment that matters most as a reason to quit, rather than the point where transformation actually begins. The solution is not to push harder in that moment. Force only increases resistance. The solution is to understand the weapon being used against you and why it works so reliably. Emotional resistance is not random noise. It is the primary defense mechanism of the old self. And until you see it clearly, it will continue to win. In the next chapter, we will break down the real price of consistency, why discomfort is unavoidable in any lasting change, and why most people unconsciously structure their lives to avoid paying that price at all costs. Proximo. Chapter 3. The Emotional Cost of Consistency. Consistency is not difficult because the actions themselves are hard. Most of what people avoid is simple, repetitive, and technically within their capacity. The real difficulty lies elsewhere. Consistency is expensive because it demands an emotional payment that most people are unwilling to make, often without realizing it. Every consistent action carries a cost that is not visible from the outside. It is not measured in effort or time, but in emotional friction. The cost shows up as boredom, irritation, restlessness, self-doubt, and a persistent sense that something else would feel better in the moment. This emotional tax is subtle, but it accumulates. And because it does not produce immediate rewards, the mind labels it as unnecessary suffering. The brain is not optimized for long-term identity upgrades. It is optimized for emotional efficiency. It constantly evaluates whether an action increases or decreases internal discomfort. When an action repeatedly produces emotional neutrality or mild negativity without immediate payoff, the system flags it as inefficient. This is why consistency feels heavy even when the task itself is easy. What most people misinterpret as laziness is actually avoidance of emotional cost. The body is not refusing to work. It is refusing to tolerate a state that feels unrewarding, uncertain, or identity-threatening. This refusal happens automatically, without conscious deliberation. By the time the mind creates a reason to stop, the decision has already been made at the emotional level. Consistency also removes stimulation. The early phase of change is rich in novelty. There are new routines, new identities to imagine, new narratives to tell yourself. Over time, that stimulation fades. What remains is repetition without applause. Progress becomes quiet. Improvement becomes incremental. And the emotional system interprets this silence as failure, even when it is evidence of real growth. This is the hidden price of consistency. You must be willing to act in states that do not feel rewarding. You must tolerate emotional flatness without interpreting it as a sign that something is wrong. You must continue without the internal reassurance that you are on the right path. For most people, this feels intolerable because they have been trained to equate good emotions with good decisions. The problem is not that the emotional cost exists. The problem is that it is misclassified. Discomfort is treated as danger. Boredom is treated as misalignment. Emotional resistance is treated as intuition. This misinterpretation causes people to retreat precisely when they are doing the most meaningful work. Each time you avoid this cost, a lesson is learned. The system learns that consistency is unsafe. It learns that withdrawal restores comfort. Over time, this conditioning deepens. The emotional cost feels heavier with each attempt, not because the task becomes harder, but because the identity associated with avoidance becomes stronger. This creates a paradox. The more you want change, the more emotional resistance you feel when acting toward it. The desire for a different future increases the threat to the current identity, and the system responds by increasing discomfort, not decreasing it. Without understanding this mechanism, people conclude that something is wrong with them. In reality, the system is functioning exactly as designed. The individuals who appear disciplined are not immune to emotional cost. They have simply stopped interpreting it as a signal to stop. They do not require consistency to feel good in order to continue. They have reclassified discomfort as neutral or even expected. As a result, the emotional system stops escalating resistance. This is the transition point where most people fail. They attempt to overcome emotional cost with force, pressure, or self-criticism. This only amplifies resistance. Emotion cannot be dominated. It must be understood and redirected. Until that happens, consistency will always feel like self-punishment rather than alignment. To move forward, discipline must be detached from emotion altogether, not suppressed, not ignored, but removed from the decision-making role. As long as emotion retains veto power over action, consistency will remain fragile. In the next chapter, we will dismantle the most common false solution to this problem: willpower. You will see why trying harder actually accelerates failure and why discipline built on force collapses faster than discipline built on identity. Chapter 4. Discipline is not willpower. Willpower is often treated as the missing ingredient in discipline. When consistency fails, the conclusion is almost always the same. You were not strong enough. You did not push hard enough. You let yourself off the hook. This interpretation feels logical because it preserves the belief that success is simply a matter of trying harder. But this belief quietly guarantees repetition of the same failure. Willpower is not a reliable force. It is a temporary allocation of mental energy. It fluctuates with sleep, stress, emotional load, and decision fatigue. It can be depleted, overwhelmed, and hijacked by competing demands. Building a system of discipline that depends on willpower is equivalent to building a structure on a resource that is known to run out. When people rely on willpower, they frame discipline as a battle. Each action becomes a test of strength. Resistance is treated as an enemy to overpower. This framing feels heroic, but it is inefficient. Every act of force creates internal opposition. The more you push, the more resistance you generate. Over time, this turns consistency into a chronic state of tension. The mind is not designed to sustain constant self-coercion. When action requires repeated internal arguments, the system looks for escape. It begins to associate the behavior with pressure and emotional strain. Even if progress is made, the cost feels high. And high-cost behaviors are abandoned as soon as external pressure is removed. This is why people can maintain discipline temporarily under intense structure. Deadlines, authority, social accountability, or fear can create short-term compliance. But when those forces disappear, behavior collapses. The discipline was never internalized. It was enforced, and enforcement does not survive freedom. Willpower also creates a dangerous identity loop. Each failure is interpreted as a personal weakness. The narrative becomes one of deficiency. Not disciplined enough, not strong enough, not built for consistency. This self-concept quietly undermines future attempts. The individual begins each new effort already doubting their capacity to endure. The deeper issue is that willpower treats discipline as an exception rather than a default. It assumes that the natural state is avoidance and that action must be forced against that tendency. This assumption is false. Avoidance is not natural. It is conditioned. And what is conditioned can be restructured. True discipline does not feel like constant resistance. It feels neutral, sometimes boring, sometimes inconvenient, but not internally violent. When discipline is identity-based, action does not require negotiation. It occurs because it aligns with who you believe you are, not because you are overpowering yourself. This is why people who are truly disciplined often struggle to explain how they do it. There is no dramatic effort to point to, no internal war. The behavior feels obvious, and because it feels obvious, it is repeatable. The system conserves energy rather than depleting it. Trying to solve inconsistency with more willpower is like trying to fix a leaking system by increasing pressure. It may hold temporarily, but the underlying structure remains flawed. The solution is not more force, it is a different architecture. To build discipline that survives when motivation and willpower are gone, action must become automatic. Automatic action does not come from intensity. It comes from identity alignment. Until behavior is anchored in self-concept, every attempt at consistency will feel like resistance against yourself. In the next chapter, we will expose the real source of inconsistency. Not laziness, not lack of effort, but the gap between who you are acting as and who you believe yourself to be. Chapter 5. The discipline gap is an identity gap. Most people believe inconsistency is a behavioral problem. They look at what they do and assume the solution is to adjust effort, strategy, or environment. When those adjustments fail, they conclude something is wrong with their character. This interpretation misses the actual mechanism at work. Inconsistency is not a failure of behavior. It is a misalignment of identity. Behavior is downstream. It is an output, not a source. Actions are selected based on what feels congruent with the current self-concept. When a behavior aligns with identity, it feels natural. When it does not, it feels heavy, forced, or temporary. The discipline gap exists because people are trying to sustain behaviors that belong to a version of themselves they have not yet become. Identity is not an abstract idea. It is a practical filter. It determines what feels reasonable, what feels excessive, and what feels unnecessary. It decides which actions require justification and which do not. A person who sees themselves as disciplined does not debate whether to follow through. A person who does not hold that identity experiences every action as a negotiation. This is why short bursts of discipline are common and long-term consistency is rare. Temporary discipline is fueled by external pressure or emotional spikes. But when those supports disappear, the behavior no longer feels self-consistent. The system reverts to actions that reinforce the familiar identity. Not because those actions are better, but because they are safer. The mind is constantly protecting identity coherence. When behavior drifts too far from the existing self-concept, internal tension rises. This tension is experienced as discomfort, doubt, or resistance. The purpose of that tension is not to guide you toward truth, but to restore internal stability. In other words, inconsistency is not sabotage. It is self-preservation. People often try to solve this problem by repeatedly restarting. New plans, new routines, new tools. Each restart feels hopeful because it temporarily suspends identity conflict. The future version of the self feels possible again. But the moment repetition begins, the same friction appears. The behavior demands a self-concept that has not yet been installed. This creates a cycle of self-betrayal. Each attempt that collapses becomes evidence that discipline is not who you are. The automatic reinforcement mechanism records this evidence silently. Over time, the identity of someone who tries and fails becomes stronger than the identity of someone who follows through. Eventually, even starting feels dishonest. What makes this especially difficult is that identity change does not respond to intention. You cannot decide your way into a new self-concept. Identity is built through accumulated evidence. What you do consistently, especially under emotional strain, is what the system uses to define you. Occasional bursts do not count. Emotional spikes do not count. Only repeated action under resistance is recorded. This is why force-based discipline backfires. When you act in a way that feels misaligned, the system resists. When resistance wins, the old identity is reinforced. Even when force temporarily succeeds, the emotional cost is high. The behavior is experienced as self-coercion, not self-expression. The identity does not absorb it. The solution is not to eliminate the gap immediately. The solution is to shrink it. Discipline must be introduced in a way that the identity can tolerate and integrate. This requires understanding the mechanics of identity conflict, not fighting it. The goal is not to behave like the ideal version of yourself, but to behave in ways that gradually make that version believable. Until discipline feels internally justified, it will remain fragile. The moment pressure is removed, the system will return to the identity it recognizes. This is not a flaw, it is how identity maintains continuity. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you must stop asking how to act and start asking who you are training yourself to become with each action. Discipline is not built by intensity. It is built by identity evidence. In the next chapter, we will examine what happens the moment you decide to change and why that decision immediately creates internal conflict. This is where identity fractures, resistance intensifies, and most transformations quietly fail before they ever begin. Chapter 6. The Two Selves at War. The moment you decide to change, an internal conflict is created. This conflict is not psychological weakness, lack of confidence, or fear of success. It is structural. Change introduces a second version of you into the system, and the system cannot immediately integrate both without tension. One version is familiar. It is built from past behavior, accumulated evidence, and emotional memory. This is the self that knows how to survive, avoid pain, and maintain stability. It is not evil or broken. It is efficient at preserving what already exists. This is the old self. The other version appears the moment a goal is set. It is imagined, future-oriented, and not yet proven. It represents growth, expansion, and a different standard of behavior. It carries possibility, but no evidence. This is the desired self. These two selves cannot coexist peacefully at first. They operate on different rules. The old self values predictability and emotional safety. The desired self requires uncertainty, effort, and delayed reward. The system experiences this as a contradiction. One self must dominate. Most people assume that wanting the desired self strongly enough will solve this conflict. It does not. Desire does not override identity hierarchy. The old self has structural advantage because it is reinforced by history. It has emotional weight, memory, and repetition on its side. The desired self exists only as intention. This is why change feels exciting at first and threatening shortly after. The decision to change activates hope, but it also alerts the old self. Once the initial emotional high fades, the old self begins to defend its position. It does not argue logically, it uses emotion. Resistance appears as fatigue, doubt, distraction, and sudden loss of urgency. The mind interprets these sensations as personal signals. In reality, they are defensive maneuvers. The old self is not trying to stop progress. It is trying to restore balance. This internal war explains why people sabotage themselves at the moment of momentum. When behavior begins to shift consistently, the desired self gains ground. This threatens the dominance of the old self. Resistance intensifies not because you are failing, but because you are succeeding. Without understanding this mechanism, people misinterpret resistance as a reason to stop. They assume the discomfort means the path is wrong or unsustainable, so they retreat. When they do, the old self regains control, relief appears, and the conflict subsides. This relief is then misread as confirmation that quitting was the right choice. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. The desired self never accumulates enough evidence to become real. Each failed attempt strengthens the old self's claim. Eventually, the idea of consistent discipline begins to feel unrealistic, even threatening. The system learns that change equals conflict, and conflict equals pain. The critical mistake is trying to eliminate the old self. That is impossible. The old self is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is a structure to be outgrown. Fighting it directly only strengthens it. Force validates its fear and increases resistance. The path forward requires a different strategy. The desired self must be built slowly through actions that generate identity evidence without triggering overwhelming resistance. The conflict must be managed, not escalated. The goal is not to win the war in a moment, but to shift the balance over time. Until this conflict is acknowledged, discipline will always feel like self-attack. You will experience progress and sabotage in cycles, never understanding why both coexist. But once the two selves are clearly identified, resistance stops being mysterious. It becomes predictable. In the next chapter, we will isolate the only weapon the old self actually uses to maintain control, why it works so effectively, and how to neutralize it without creating more. Internal conflict. Chapter 7. Emotional resistance. The old self's only weapon. The old self does not argue with logic. It does not present structured counterplans or rational objections to your goals. It does not need to. Logic is slow, and identity defense must be fast. The old self survives through a single mechanism that is both subtle and overwhelming when misunderstood. Emotional resistance. Emotional resistance is not a flaw. It is not trauma, weakness, or pathology. It is a control system. Its function is simple: prevent sustained behavior that would destabilize the current identity. Everything else is secondary. The old self does not care whether the change is good for you, productive, or necessary. It only cares whether the change threatens continuity. This is why emotional resistance appears precisely when action begins to matter, not at the moment of decision, but at the moment of repetition. Not when you imagine change, but when you embody it. As soon as behavior starts generating new identity evidence, resistance activates. Most people believe resistance means something is wrong. That belief gives resistance its power. Resistance rarely shows up as a clear command to stop. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, reasonable, and convincing. It arrives as subtle emotional shifts, a sense of heaviness where there was lightness before, a dull irritation toward tasks that previously felt meaningful, a sudden questioning of priorities, a feeling that rest, delay, or distraction would be healthier or smarter. These sensations feel personal. They feel like intuition. They feel like truth. But they are not evaluations of reality. They are regulatory signals designed to restore the old equilibrium. The old self cannot force you to stop. It can only make continuing feel wrong. Fear is one form of resistance, but it is not the most common. Doubt is more effective. Fatigue is more convincing. Apathy is especially powerful because it removes urgency without creating alarm. Procrastination feels harmless. Overthinking feels intelligent. Emotional flatness feels like a sign that the path has lost meaning. What makes emotional resistance so dangerous is that it speaks in your own voice. It does not announce itself as sabotage. It presents itself as you being realistic, cautious, or self-aware. This is why people trust it. Every time resistance succeeds, the old self is reinforced. The system learns that discomfort leads to withdrawal, and withdrawal restores emotional safety. This lesson is stored without language. It becomes instinct. The next time resistance appears, it requires less intensity to produce the same result. Over time, This creates an anticipatory effect. Resistance begins earlier in the process. The emotional cost appears sooner. The threshold you must cross to remain consistent becomes higher. Eventually, even planning feels heavy. Even thinking about discipline triggers avoidance. This is why people say they feel blocked. They are not blocked. They are regulated. The modern mistake is trying to defeat resistance with force, pushing harder, shaming oneself, escalating pressure, or attempting to overpower emotion. This approach always fails in the long term. Emotional resistance is adaptive. When force increases, resistance adapts by intensifying or changing form. What begins as doubt becomes exhaustion. What begins as fear becomes numbness. Force validates the old self's belief that change is dangerous. It confirms that discipline equals internal violence. The system responds by protecting itself more aggressively. Another common mistake is trying to eliminate resistance entirely. This is also impossible. Resistance is not an error in the system. It is part of how identity maintains coherence. The goal is not to destroy resistance, but to remove its authority. Resistance should not be obeyed, but it should be understood. The moment you misclassify resistance as a signal to stop, you lose. The moment you classify it as evidence that identity is being challenged, you gain leverage. Resistance is not a warning sign, it is a progress indicator. It shows you exactly where the boundary of your current self-concept lies. This reframing changes everything. When resistance appears, the question is no longer whether to continue. The question becomes how to continue without escalating internal conflict. This requires precision, not aggression. It requires reducing the emotional load of action while maintaining behavioral continuity. The disciplined individual is not someone who feels less resistance. It is someone who has trained themselves not to treat resistance as a decision maker. They feel it, notice it, and act anyway, but not through force, through neutrality. This neutrality is critical. When action is taken calmly, without emotional charge, resistance loses its amplification. Emotion feeds on reaction. When there is no reaction, resistance cannot grow. Over time, the old self learns that its signals no longer control behavior. When this happens consistently, resistance weakens automatically. This is the inflection point of transformation, not when motivation returns, not when confidence appears, but when emotional resistance loses veto power. Most people never reach this point because they personalize resistance. They believe it reflects truth about themselves or the path. As a result, they negotiate with it, obey it, or fight it. All three responses strengthen it. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you must learn to see resistance as mechanical, predictable, and impersonal. It is not you. It is a system response to identity threat. Once this is clear, resistance stops being mysterious and starts being manageable. But understanding resistance is not enough. You must also learn how discipline actually operates when emotion is removed from the equation. Because discipline is not a behavior, and it is not a feeling, it is a state of being. In the next chapter, we will dismantle the idea that discipline is something you do and show, why it only becomes stable when it becomes a state you inhabit. Chapter 8. Discipline as a state of being. Most people treat discipline as an action they perform, something they turn on when needed and abandon when it becomes inconvenient. This framing guarantees inconsistency, because actions are situational. They depend on context, energy, emotion, and incentive. A state of being does not. A state of being is the dominant internal tone from which perception, decision, and behavior emerge. It is the background condition of the system. When discipline exists as a state, action is no longer preceded by debate. It arises naturally from how reality is interpreted in that state. This is why disciplined individuals do not experience constant internal struggle. The struggle disappears not because the tasks are easier, but because the internal environment has changed. What once required effort now feels obvious. What once felt optional now feels non-negotiable. States are not created by thought alone. They are patterns of emotional baseline, physiological posture, and attentional focus. When someone is in a distracted state, disciplined behavior feels unnatural. When someone is in a disciplined state, distraction feels unnatural. The behavior follows the state, not the other way around. This is the fundamental mistake most people make. They attempt to produce discipline by forcing behavior while remaining in an undisciplined state. This creates friction. The action feels foreign. The system resists. Over time, the emotional cost accumulates and behavior collapses. A disciplined state is not intense. It is not aggressive or emotionally elevated. It is calm, narrow, and deliberate. It reduces internal noise. It simplifies choice. It removes excess options from consideration. In this state, action does not feel heroic. It feels procedural. The transition into a disciplined state is subtle. It does not require motivation. It requires alignment. When the internal environment is structured correctly, discipline becomes the path of least resistance. When it is not, discipline always feels like self-opposition. This is why people can behave with extreme discipline in one area of life and none in another. The state is context dependent. At work, structure, expectation, and identity reinforce the disciplined state. At home, those reinforcements disappear, and a different state dominates. The individual does not change. The state does. The goal is not to be disciplined all the time. That is unrealistic. The goal is to be able to enter a disciplined state deliberately, regardless of motivation. This is a skill, and like any skill, it can be trained. Training a state requires repetition, but not repetition of behavior alone. It requires repetition of internal alignment. Each time you act from a disciplined state, even briefly, the system records that state as accessible. Over time, the transition becomes faster and less effortful. Most people never train this. They wait for motivation to push them into action and mistake that emotional surge for discipline. When motivation disappears, they have no entry point, no state to access, no internal posture to return to. This is why discipline must be decoupled from desire. Desire is volatile. States are stable. When discipline depends on desire, it collapses. When discipline is embedded as a state of being, it persists, even when desire is absent. The key shift is this. You do not ask whether you feel like acting. You ask which state you are currently inhabiting. And if the state is not conducive to discipline, you do not negotiate behavior, you change the state. This requires understanding how states are activated and how quickly they can be shifted. It requires recognizing the internal signals that indicate drift. And it requires the ability to return without drama or self-judgment. Once discipline is established as a state of being, motivation becomes irrelevant. Action occurs because it fits the state, not because it feels good. This is the beginning of true consistency. In the next chapter, we will map the full causal chain that connects identity, state, action, and reality, and show how discipline becomes inevitable when this system is understood and aligned. Chapter 9. The Omnimorphic Causal Chain. Most people attempt to build discipline by intervening at the most visible layer of their lives. They try to change what they do. When that fails, they try to change how they feel. When that also fails, they conclude that discipline is unreliable, exhausting, or simply not part of who they are. This conclusion feels personal, but it is incorrect. The failure is not moral, it is architectural. Human behavior is not random, emotional, or mysterious. It follows a strict causal order. This order operates whether you understand it or not. Discipline does not exist outside of this system. It is produced by it. At the highest level of causation sits identity. Identity is not what you say about yourself. It is the sum of what the system believes to be true based on accumulated evidence. Identity defines what feels normal, what feels excessive, and what feels unrealistic. It sets the upper and lower bounds of behavior long before conscious thought appears. From identity emerges a state of being. This state is the internal climate of the system. It is the baseline tone of emotion, attention, and expectation. The state determines how the world is perceived. It filters information. It decides what feels urgent, what feels irrelevant, and what feels intolerable. You do not consciously select a state, you inhabit it. From this state, actions are selected automatically, not chosen in the philosophical sense, but made available. Certain behaviors feel obvious, others feel absurd, others never even appear as options. This is why discipline feels effortless in some moments and impossible in others. The available action set changes with the state. Once action occurs, external reality responds. Results are produced. Progress is made or not made. Feedback appears in the form of outcomes, reactions, numbers, sensations, and consequences. This feedback is then interpreted by the system, not objectively, but emotionally. And this interpretation is what feeds back into identity. This closes the loop. Identity creates state. State selects action. Action shapes reality. Reality feeds back into identity. This loop runs continuously. Every day, every hour, every attempt at discipline either reinforces it or weakens it. There is no neutral action. The reason most people never achieve stable discipline is because they attempt to fight this loop instead of working with it. They try to force action while identity resists. They try to override state with willpower. They try to use outcomes as motivation instead of evidence. Each of these attempts creates internal friction. When identity and action are misaligned, the system experiences stress. That stress is interpreted as emotional resistance. The body signals discomfort not because the action is wrong, but because it is inconsistent with the current identity. If the action stops, the loop stabilizes. If the action continues without proper alignment, the system escalates resistance. This is why discipline collapses under pressure, not because pressure is bad, but because the internal structure cannot support it. Most people misunderstand feedback. They treat results as judgment rather than information. When results are good, identity inflates. When results are bad, identity contracts. This creates volatility. Discipline becomes dependent on outcomes instead of commitment. When progress slows or disappears, so does consistency. A disciplined system works in the opposite direction. Feedback is not used to determine worth. It is used to train identity. Small actions performed consistently under resistance are interpreted as proof of who you are becoming regardless of outcome. This is how identity shifts. Not through dramatic success, but through repeated alignment. This is also why motivation is irrelevant inside this loop. Motivation is a transient emotional state. It can temporarily elevate action, but it does not restructure identity. When motivation fades, the loop returns to its previous configuration. The old identity reasserts itself. The state collapses. Action stops. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you must become fluent in this causal chain. You must stop treating discipline as an isolated behavior and start treating it as an emergent property of alignment. You intervene at the wrong level, and the system corrects you. You intervene upstream, and the system cooperates. This is where most people resist. Identity feels abstract, action feels concrete. So they cling to action-level solutions. But the system does not reward effort, it rewards coherence. Once identity begins to shift, everything downstream changes automatically. States become easier to enter. Actions feel less negotiable. Feedback becomes less destabilizing. Discipline stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like something that happens. But this raises a critical question. If identity is shaped by evidence and evidence comes from action, how does identity ever change without force? How does the desired self gain ground when the old self already dominates the loop? The answer lies in understanding how identity measures progress. It does not measure intensity. It does not measure desire. It measures accumulation. In the next chapter, you will see why every action is a vote, why most people unknowingly vote against the person they want to become, and how discipline becomes inevitable once you learn how to stack votes in your favor. Chapter 10. Every action is a vote. Most people believe change happens when an action is big enough, intense enough, or painful enough to matter. They look for turning points, breakthroughs, decisive moments that permanently alter who they are. This belief is seductive, but it is false. Identity does not respond to drama. It responds to accumulation. The system that defines who you are does not ask how much you wanted something or how strongly you felt in a single moment. It asks a simpler question: what keeps happening? Identity is not shaped by isolated actions. It is shaped by patterns, and patterns are built one action at a time. Every action you take is interpreted as evidence, not consciously, but automatically. The system records what you do, especially under emotional pressure, and uses it to update its model of who you are. This process is always running. You cannot pause it. You cannot opt out. There is no such thing as a neutral action. Each action is a vote. When you act in alignment with the person you want to become, you cast a vote for that identity. When you avoid, delay, or retreat under resistance, you cast a vote for the old identity. The system tallies these votes relentlessly. It does not care about intentions. It does not care about plans. It does not care about explanations. Only behavior counts. This is where most people sabotage themselves without realizing it. They assume that small actions do not matter. Skipping once feels harmless. Delaying feels strategic. Quitting for the day feels insignificant. But the system is not measuring scale. It is measuring consistency. A small action repeated is more powerful than a large action performed once. The repeated action sends a clear signal. It says this behavior is normal. This behavior is safe. This behavior is who we are. Over time, the system accepts this signal as truth. This is why people can intellectually believe they want change while behavior proves the opposite. Their votes do not match their words, and identity always sides with votes. What makes this especially difficult is that votes are weighted emotionally. An action taken while calm and aligned carries a different impact than the same action taken while stressed, doubtful, or resistant. When you act despite resistance, the system records not just the behavior, but the context. It learns that this identity persists even under pressure. This is why discipline formed during easy periods rarely lasts. Easy votes carry little weight. Hard votes carry enormous weight. Acting when motivation is gone, when progress is slow, when emotion is flat or negative, sends the strongest possible signal to identity. Conversely, avoiding action during resistance sends an equally strong signal in the opposite direction. It teaches the system that discomfort leads to withdrawal. That lesson becomes policy. The next time resistance appears, the system expects retreat. Over time, resistance no longer needs to escalate. Avoidance becomes automatic. Most people are unknowingly voting against themselves. They start strong, accumulate a few positive votes, then retreat when resistance appears. The retreat cancels out far more than they realize. It does not return identity to neutral. It strengthens the old self by proving its dominance. This is why restarts feel harder each time. The system remembers previous votes. It remembers that discipline collapsed under pressure before. The threshold for belief rises. More evidence is required to shift identity, not less. The disciplined individual understands this mechanism intuitively. They do not chase perfect days. They do not require emotional alignment. They focus on casting votes consistently, especially when it is uncomfortable. They protect the chain. They understand that missing once is not the danger. Missing and rationalizing is. This reframes discipline completely. The goal is no longer to feel disciplined. The goal is to accumulate votes for the identity you want until that identity becomes statistically dominant. Once that happens, behavior changes automatically. The system stops offering alternatives. Action feels obvious. This is also why identity change feels slow and then sudden. For a long time, votes accumulate without visible effect. The old identity still has the majority, but once a tipping point is reached, behavior flips. What once required effort now feels natural. This is not magic, it is mathematics. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you must stop thinking in terms of days and start thinking in terms of votes. You must stop asking whether an action feels worth it and start asking what identity it reinforces. You must act in ways that make the desired self statistically inevitable. However, there is a critical factor most people miss. Not all votes are counted equally. Some actions barely register, others permanently alter the balance. The difference is not the size of the action, but the emotional context in which it is taken. In the next chapter, we will expose what determines the weight of a vote, how emotion amplifies or neutralizes identity evidence, and why learning to act correctly under emotion is the final leverage point of discipline. Chapter 11. Emotion determines the weight of the vote. Two people can take the same action and produce completely different identity outcomes. One repeats the behavior for weeks and sees no internal shift. The other performs it fewer times and experiences a permanent change in self-concept. The difference is not discipline, intelligence, or genetics. It is emotion. The identity system does not measure behavior in isolation. It measures behavior in context. Emotion is the language through which experience is interpreted and stored. Without emotional signal, actions register weakly. With emotional intensity, actions imprint deeply. This is why certain moments in life permanently alter identity, while years of repetition in other areas leave no trace. When you act in a neutral or positive emotional state, the vote you cast is light. It still counts, but it does not challenge existing identity. The system interprets it as situational. When you act in the presence of resistance, doubt, fear, or discomfort, the vote becomes heavy. It signals that the behavior persists even when the internal environment is hostile. This directly contradicts the old identity. This is why motivation-based discipline rarely creates identity change. Motivation softens emotion. It makes action feel good, pleasant, supported. The system interprets these actions as conditional. They do not redefine who you are. When the emotional context disappears, the behavior disappears with it. Emotion amplifies meaning. A single action taken while uncomfortable can outweigh dozens taken while excited. The system concludes that if you acted under those conditions, the behavior must be part of your core identity. This is how discipline becomes internalized. Most people misunderstand this and attempt to eliminate negative emotion before acting. They wait to feel ready, confident, or inspired. In doing so, they remove the very condition that would make the action transformative. They are unintentionally neutralizing their own progress. This does not mean you should seek suffering or force intensity. It means you must stop treating emotional discomfort as a stop signal. Discomfort is not damage, it is data. It indicates that identity boundaries are being challenged. Avoiding action when emotion is heavy teaches the system that identity is fragile. Acting calmly in the presence of emotion teaches the system that identity is stable. The emotional content is absorbed, not amplified. This is also why emotional reactions after action matter. If you act and then immediately self-criticize, complain, or mentally withdraw, you dilute the vote. The system records the ambivalence, but if you act and then internally acknowledge the behavior as aligned, the vote is consolidated. The strongest identity evidence is created when action is taken without drama. Not aggressively, not heroically, but steadily, while emotion is present and not obeyed. This teaches the system that emotion no longer has veto power. Over time, this retrains the emotional response itself. Resistance stops escalating because it stops working. The system learns that emotional signals no longer change behavior. As a result, those signals weaken. This is the hidden leverage point of discipline, not eliminating emotion, but removing its authority, not waiting to feel better, but acting while feeling exactly as you do. Most people never experience this because they believe discipline requires feeling disciplined. They wait for emotional alignment before moving. In doing so, they ensure that every vote they cast is light. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you must allow emotion to be present without letting it decide. This is how actions begin to reshape identity instead of bouncing off it. But for identity change to become permanent, the system must repeatedly interpret these actions as proof, not exceptions. This requires a mechanism that converts experience into stable self-concept automatically. In the next chapter, we will examine the automatic reinforcement mechanism, how it silently locks behaviors into identity, and how to use it deliberately to make discipline self-sustaining. Chapter 12, the automatic reinforcement mechanism. Most people assume identity changes when they consciously decide it should. They believe that repetition alone, if sustained long enough, will eventually rewire who they are. This assumption is partially true and dangerously incomplete. Repetition does not change identity by itself. Interpretation does. Every experience you have is automatically processed by a mechanism that answers a single question. What does this say about me? This process does not require intention or awareness. It happens below language, below narrative, below conscious control. This is the automatic reinforcement mechanism. The function of this mechanism is efficiency. The brain cannot evaluate every decision from scratch. It needs shortcuts. Identity is that shortcut. It is a compressed model built from past behavior and emotional context. The automatic reinforcement mechanism is the system that updates that model. When you act, the system observes what happened, how it felt, and how you responded internally afterward. It then converts that data into identity evidence. This evidence is stored as expectation. Expectation becomes belief. Belief becomes default behavior. Most people unknowingly train this mechanism against themselves. They take action, but only when they feel good. The system records that action is conditional. They quit when discomfort appears. The system records that withdrawal restores safety. They succeed and dismiss it as luck. The system records that success is not self-generated. They fail and personalize it. The system records that failure is who they are. None of this requires conscious agreement. The mechanism operates regardless of intention. This is why two people can follow the same routine and produce opposite identity outcomes. One uses each action as confirmation of alignment. The other treats each action as an exception. The behavior looks identical from the outside. Internally, the identity impact is completely different. The automatic reinforcement mechanism is especially sensitive to moments of emotional intensity. What you do when tired, doubtful, bored, or frustrated carries disproportionate weight. But even more important is what you conclude afterward. The internal commentary following action determines how the experience is categorized. If you act and internally register the action as proof that you are disciplined, the mechanism consolidates that belief. If you act and immediately minimize it, complain about it, or frame it as unsustainable, the mechanism weakens or reverses the vote. This is why discipline often collapses even when behavior is technically consistent. The internal narrative is misaligned. The system is being trained to see discipline as temporary, forced, or unnatural. The most dangerous form of reinforcement is relief-based reinforcement. When you stop an uncomfortable behavior and feel relief, the system records a powerful lesson. Discomfort leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal leads to safety. This lesson becomes automatic. Over time, the mere anticipation of discomfort triggers avoidance. Most people believe they are quitting because they are tired or busy. In reality, they are responding to a deeply learned safety signal. To reverse this pattern, the automatic reinforcement mechanism must be retrained. This does not require positive thinking or affirmations. It requires precise alignment between action, emotion, and interpretation. Action must occur even when emotion is neutral or negative. Emotion must be allowed without escalation. Interpretation must be deliberate and minimal. The system must be shown repeatedly that discipline occurs without catastrophe and without internal conflict. When this alignment is consistent, something important happens. The mechanism stops questioning the behavior. It begins to assume it. Discipline moves from effort to expectation. Expectation removes negotiation. At this point, discipline no longer feels like something you are maintaining. It feels like something you would have to actively break. This is the shift most people never experience because they never allow the mechanism to complete its work. Understanding this mechanism changes how you evaluate progress. You stop asking whether you feel different. You stop demanding motivation as proof. You start paying attention to what identity evidence is being recorded. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you must become intentional about what the system is learning from your behavior. Every action teaches it something. Silence teaches it something. Avoidance teaches it something. The system is always listening. But there is a final obstacle that appears even when all of this is understood. A moment when desire is absent, emotion is heavy, and no internal support is available. This is where most systems fail, not because they are wrong, but because they are incomplete. In the next chapter, we will address the exact moment when you must act without desire, without emotional fuel, and without internal agreement, and how discipline operates when nothing inside you wants to move. Chapter 13. Acting without desire. There will be moments when nothing inside you supports action, no motivation, no urgency, no emotional momentum. The task does not feel meaningful. The outcome does not feel compelling. Even the identity you are building feels distant. This is the moment most people believe discipline is impossible. In reality, this is the only moment when discipline is real. Desire is not required for action. Desire is a preference signal, not a command. The system treats it as optional. When desire is present, action feels smooth. When it is absent, action feels unnatural. But unnatural does not mean wrong. It means unfamiliar. Most people have been conditioned to move only when desire is present. They interpret the absence of desire as a signal to wait. Over time, this trains the system to require internal permission before acting. Action becomes dependent on feeling a certain way. This dependency is fragile. Acting without desire breaks this dependency. It teaches the system that behavior does not require emotional alignment. This is not about forcing yourself through pain. It is about removing desire from the decision-making role. When desire is absent, the mind looks for justification to stop. It searches for reasons to delay, optimize, or avoid. These reasons feel rational because they reduce discomfort. But they are not evaluations of reality. They are attempts to restore emotional comfort. At this point, most people either obey the signal or escalate force. Both responses fail. Obedience reinforces avoidance. Force escalates resistance. The correct response is neither. The correct response is neutrality. Neutral action is the ability to move without emotional investment. No expectation of reward, no internal negotiation, no dramatic self-talk, just execution. This feels strange at first because the system is used to emotional engagement. But neutrality is powerful. Emotion cannot amplify resistance when it is not engaged. This is why small actions matter so much when desire is gone. The goal is not to perform at full capacity. The goal is to preserve continuity. Continuity tells the system that the identity persists regardless of internal state. When you act without desire, the vote you cast is extremely heavy. The system learns that discipline is not conditional. This undermines the old identity at its core. Over time, desire stops being required because the system no longer expects it. Most people mistake this process for burnout. They believe acting without desire will drain them. In reality, the opposite happens. Burnout comes from internal conflict, not from neutral action. When you stop arguing with yourself, energy is conserved. Acting without desire does not mean ignoring limits or abandoning rest. It means distinguishing between genuine exhaustion and emotional resistance. One requires recovery. The other requires continuity. Confusing the two is one of the most common forms of self-sabotage. This skill must be trained gradually. If you attempt to overhaul behavior in a state of low desire, resistance will spike. But if you maintain minimal standards, the system adapts. Desire eventually returns, but it is no longer required. This is the point where discipline begins to feel quiet. There is no internal celebration, no emotional reward, just stability. This stability is what most people have never experienced. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you must learn to act without internal agreement, not because you are punishing yourself, but because you are teaching the system that discipline is not up for debate. However, there is a final challenge that appears precisely at this stage. Thoughts begin to interfere, subtle narratives arise, doubt becomes articulate. The mind starts presenting arguments rather than emotions. In the next chapter, we will introduce a precise protocol for dealing with sabotaging thoughts in real time, without suppression and without falling back into negotiation. Proximo Chapter 14, the Disarm Protocol. Once emotion stops controlling behavior, the mind attempts a different strategy. Resistance becomes articulate. Instead of heaviness or apathy, thoughts appear. They sound reasonable, measured, strategic. This is the final line of defense of the old identity, and it is far more dangerous than emotion because it presents itself as intelligence. Thought-based resistance does not say stop. It says reconsider. It suggests adjustments, improvements, delays, and alternatives. It frames avoidance as optimization. This is why people who understand discipline intellectually still fail to execute. The interference is no longer emotional, it is cognitive. These thoughts are not neutral, they are not objective analysis, they are identity-preserving narratives designed to reopen negotiation. If emotion could not stop you, logic will try. Most people make the mistake of engaging with these thoughts. They argue with them, analyze them, or attempt to replace them with positive thinking. All of these responses fail because they grant the thought legitimacy. The moment you debate a sabotaging thought, you accept its authority to decide. The Disarm Protocol exists to remove that authority. Disarm is not a motivational technique, it is a containment system. Its purpose is not to eliminate thoughts, but to prevent them from influencing action. Thoughts are allowed to exist, they are not obeyed. The first step is detection. You must recognize the moment a thought attempts to interfere with execution. These thoughts are identifiable by their timing. They appear immediately before action. They feel urgent, clever, or protective. They often include phrases like, just this once, you can do it later, you need more information, or this isn't the best time. The content is irrelevant. The timing is everything. Once detected, the thought must be isolated. Isolation means separating the thought from your identity. The thought is something you are experiencing, not something you are. This distinction is critical. Thoughts gain power when they are treated as self. When isolated, they lose emotional charge. After isolation, simplification occurs. Most sabotaging thoughts are complex by design. Complexity creates paralysis. Simplification reduces the situation to its core decision. Action or avoidance. Continue or stop. Everything else is noise. When the decision is simplified, the illusion of nuance collapses. The next step is alignment. Alignment means reconnecting the action to identity rather than emotion or logic. The question is not whether the action feels good or makes sense in the moment. The question is whether this action aligns with the person you are becoming. Identity answers faster than logic. Alignment bypasses debate. Response follows. Response is execution, not dramatic, not forceful, minimal, immediate. The smallest action that preserves continuity is enough. The goal is not performance. The goal is identity evidence. The final step is memorization. This is the most overlooked component. After action is taken, the system must register what just happened. You acted despite interference. The internal note is simple and factual. I acted anyway. No celebration, no criticism, just acknowledgement. This locks the lesson into the automatic reinforcement mechanism. What makes disarm effective is that it does not fight the mind. It outpaces it. Thoughts are slow. Action is fast. When action occurs before thoughts can expand, interference collapses. Most people believe discipline requires mental clarity. This is false. Discipline requires procedural clarity. You do not need to feel certain. You need to know what to do when uncertainty appears. Over time, the mind adapts. When thoughts stop influencing behavior, they stop appearing with the same intensity. The system learns that cognitive resistance no longer works. When this happens, execution becomes quiet again. Disarm is not something you use occasionally. It is something you default to. Each successful application weakens the old identity's influence. Each failure strengthens it. There is no partial effect. This protocol is what allows discipline to operate even under sophisticated self-deception. It prevents intelligence from becoming a liability. It restores action as the primary language of identity. But there is still one final misconception that must be dismantled. Many people believe that visualizing success will produce discipline. Most visualization techniques fail because they target the wrong layer of the system. In the next chapter, we will rebuild visualization from first principles and show how it can be used not to fantasize about results, but to program action when resistance appears. Chapter 15. Visualization. That actually creates discipline. Most visualization fails because it is designed to feel good rather than to change behavior. People imagine outcomes, success, recognition, freedom, and relief. The images are pleasant. The emotions are positive. And nothing changes. At best, motivation spikes briefly. At worst, the brain mistakes fantasy for progress and reduces urgency to act. Visualization does not exist to inspire you. It exists to train your nervous system. The brain does not distinguish clearly between vividly imagined experience and real experience. It distinguishes based on emotional intensity, repetition, and relevance to action. When visualization is used correctly, it creates familiarity. Familiarity reduces resistance. Resistance is what makes action feel heavy. When resistance drops, action becomes obvious. Most people visualize the wrong thing. They imagine results instead of behaviors. Results are abstract. They occur in the future. They do not map onto immediate action. The system cannot execute a result. It can only execute a behavior. When you visualize outcomes, you activate desire, not discipline. Correct visualization focuses on the exact moment where resistance normally appears, the moment before action, the moment of hesitation, the moment when emotion and thought attempt to intervene. This is the moment that must be rehearsed. Visualization is not daydreaming, it is rehearsal under constraint. When done correctly, visualization is short, 5 to 10 seconds, no storyline, no narrative arc, just a single slice of action. You see yourself beginning the behavior while emotion is present. You feel the resistance, and you see yourself acting anyway, calmly, without intensity. The emotional tone is critical. It is not excitement, it is neutrality. Calm execution in the presence of resistance teaches the system that the behavior is safe. Safety is what the nervous system requires before it allows repetition. Repetition is what installs the pattern. Visualization works through the same mechanisms as real action, but with lower cost. Each repetition weakens the novelty of resistance. The first time you imagine acting under discomfort, the system reacts. The 10th time, less so. The 50th time, the pattern feels familiar. When the real moment arrives, the brain recognizes it. Recognition reduces friction. This is why visualization must be specific. Vague imagery does nothing. You must visualize the exact behavior in the exact context at the exact point where you usually stop. The brain does not generalize discipline well. It learns in situations. Another mistake people make is using visualization to escape discomfort. They imagine feeling powerful, confident, unstoppable. This reinforces dependence on emotional states. When those states are absent, discipline collapses. Visualization should remove the requirement for those states, not reinforce it. The goal is not to feel better. The goal is to make action boring. When action becomes boring, it becomes repeatable. When it becomes repeatable, it becomes identity. Visualization should also be brief and frequent. Long sessions create diminishing returns. The system learns through exposure, not immersion. A few seconds, repeated daily, is enough to reduce resistance dramatically over time. Used correctly, visualization shifts discipline from reactive to proactive. Instead of waiting for resistance to appear and then managing it, you train the system ahead of time. When resistance shows up, it finds no leverage. This is why visualization must be paired with action. Visualization alone installs familiarity. Action installs evidence. Together, they accelerate identity change without force. Most people abandon visualization because they expect emotional payoff. When it does not feel inspiring, they assume it is not working. In reality, the absence of emotional payoff is a sign that it is working. The system is being trained, not entertained. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, visualization must serve execution, not fantasy. It must reduce the internal cost of acting, not inflate desire for results. When visualization is used this way, discipline stops feeling like something you summon. It becomes something the system defaults to. The brain stops asking whether to act and starts assuming that action will occur. At this point, one final shift remains. Discipline must move from something you practice into something you no longer negotiate. Not because you are rigid, but because the question no longer appears. In the final chapter, we will consolidate everything into the identity of the person who does not negotiate with themselves and show how discipline becomes inevitable rather than maintained. Chapter 16. Becoming the person who does not negotiate. At the beginning of this process, discipline feels like a decision. Then it feels like an effort. Later, it feels like a skill. But the final form of discipline does not feel like any of these. It feels like absence. The absence of debate, the absence of hesitation, the absence of internal bargaining. Most people believe discipline means saying yes to the right action. In reality, it means no longer asking the question. Negotiation is the hidden drain behind inconsistency. Every time you pause to ask whether you should act, you reopen the system to emotion, thought, and identity conflict. Even when the answer is yes, the cost has already been paid. Energy has been spent. Resistance has been fed attention. Over time, this makes discipline feel exhausting, even when execution is minimal. The person who stays disciplined when motivation is gone is not constantly choosing discipline. They have removed the choice from the choice. Consideration. Certain actions are no longer evaluated. They are assumed. Not because of rigidity or obsession, but because identity has stabilized around them. This is what inevitability feels like internally. Inevitability is not confidence. It is not intensity. It is not belief in outcomes. It is structural alignment. The system expects action to occur, so it does. When expectation is present, alternatives stop appearing. When alternatives disappear, discipline becomes quiet. This is why rules outperform goals. Goals invite negotiation. Rules close the loop. A rule is not an emotional commitment. It is an identity boundary. It says this is what happens here, no explanation required. But rules only work when they are congruent with identity. Otherwise, they become oppressive and trigger rebellion. The shift happens when rules stop feeling imposed and start feeling descriptive. This is how I operate. This is what I do. At this stage, discipline no longer requires motivation, visualization, protocols, or techniques in the moment. Those tools were scaffolding. They were used to train the system. Once training is complete, the scaffolding is removed. What remains is expectation. Expectation governs state. State governs action. Action reinforces identity. The loop closes cleanly. There is no friction because nothing is being forced. This does not mean resistance disappears entirely. It means resistance no longer matters. Emotional fluctuations still occur. Thoughts still appear. Fatigue still exists. None of these have authority. They are background noise, not signals. The old self has not been destroyed. It has been outvoted. The desired self no longer feels aspirational. It feels factual. The identity evidence has accumulated to the point where behaving otherwise would feel strange. Inconsistency would require effort. Avoidance would feel like disruption. This is the reversal most people never reach. They assume discipline will always feel like Sacrifice. They assume consistency requires constant vigilance. These assumptions are artifacts of misalignment. When identity shifts, effort flips direction. The final test of discipline is not whether you can push yourself on hard days, it is whether you even consider not acting. When the question no longer arises, discipline has completed its transition from behavior to being. To stay disciplined when motivation is gone, you do not need to become stronger, more driven, or more inspired. You need to become inevitable. You need to build an identity that assumes execution and treats deviation as irrelevant. This book was never about doing more. It was about removing what interferes with doing what you already decided matters. When discipline stops being negotiated, consistency stops being fragile. When consistency stops being fragile, results stop being surprising. And when results stop being surprising, success is no longer something you chase. It is simply what happens